Hello and welcome to another episode of Captive Minds. I'm Shaenah Batterson and I will be your host for today. I'm a writer based in Eugene, Oregon. Um, I've been published in Cover Action magazine a few times now, and I have a Substack page called The Red Letter. Joining me, as always, is my co-host Max Perry. Hi, Max.
Hey Shayna. Hello everyone. Good to be back for another episode.
Max is an independent journalist located in Baltimore who is currently syndicated with CAM, and I suggest that everyone go and check out his work. Anyways, today's episode is going to focus on the intersection of New Age religion or spirituality, whatever you want to call it, and capitalism. Although one could argue that the Trump administration and, for say, the trad wife movement represent an upsurge in Christian nationalism, there also seems to be an emergent interest in Eastern spiritualities and the occult in the Imperial Core with a cultural focus on mindfulness. I mean, there's even a phenomenon of urban shamans and Reiki masters with these upper middle class women becoming shamans, sort of as a way to, I don't know, entertain themselves and feel closer to nature in their alienating suburbia. But the way in which the market has caught on to this trend is astounding, and you can go into many stores these days and find crystals, moon journals, and tarot decks, and the like. Occultism, which we discussed in a previous episode where we traced its uncomfortable historical parallels with Nazism, and other New Age spiritualities are not currently challenging capitalism and undermining the existing order. To the contrary, in some ways, some of these beliefs seem to actually justify the existing order. Yet, historically, of course, religion and spirituality has served this function quite often, so it is not unprecedented. But I would say that in many respects, the New Age movement also represents philosophical idealism, which has been used to justify the existing order as well as to discredit Marxism. Before we go further, I'd like to just explain a bit about the difference between materialism, dialectical and historical materialism specifically being the method of thought of Marxism, and philosophical idealism, particularly subjective idealism, which is something that some of the New Age beliefs sometimes lapse into. There are different forms of philosophical materialism, but I'm specifically going to talk about dialectical materialism, which underscores the constant motion of life and history with contradictions bringing about their own solutions. The dialectical method views nature and the world as an interconnected, ever-evolving whole, with each part related and determined by the other parts as well as the totality. This understanding of the world, of course, undermines any conception that certain social orders and social constructs are eternal and natural. Rather, they are historical and appropriate for certain time periods and modes of production. Sorry, that was a bit of a digression, but at the core, Marxist materialism and materialism in general states that matter is primary and the mind or ideas are shaped and conditioned by the objective world outside of the self. The body is not a truck that the mind is driving, rather, consciousness is an outgrowth of embodied existence. Objective reality exists outside the human mind, and ideas historically develop out of the historical situation of the thinkers and the modes of production and social organization of the time in which they lived. Our thoughts are at times distorted reflections, but reflections of the world around us. Contrarily, philosophical idealism posits that ideas or the mind is primary and matter is secondary. History is driven by great ideas, and where these ideas originate from is sort of obfuscated. Certain strains of idealism go so far as to say that material reality outside of the human consciousness does not exist at all. If humans do not experience something, it does not exist. ultimately, with philosophical idealism, the mind becomes the determining power and the most important factor. It is an outlook which has historically been used to obscure the concrete historical origins of elements of the social structure and has been combated fiercely at an ideological level by quite a few astute Marxists, obviously Marx and Engels among them. Not to digress too much, I'll return to how the New Age spirituality sometimes lapses into this subjective idealism when, for example, one sees a variety of self-help books which suggests that one manifests what one wants to achieve in life, whereby someone has to just wish hard enough for something and put out enough positive vibes and it will somehow come true. Like they sort of say that someone is ailing from poor health, which is actually, due to your material body. It isn't, rather, because you have been manifesting suffering instead of wellness. If someone is poor or otherwise economically disadvantaged, is because they did not manifest the desire for money strong enough. And of course, one can see this argument, if it's taken far enough, that one manifests or chooses what one has in one's life, or some people even go so far as to say one chooses who they're born as, how it absolves any sort of accountability for any structural inequalities or atrocities. Well, one could say that, oh, the children that have died in Gaza chose to be born there. You can see how bad of an argument this begins to become. So, and it's easy to see how this is, in essence, a form of subjective idealism taken to an absurd degree, and the way that it would defend the existing order. Instead of class inequality as something structural, it becomes an individual mental choice or a lack of proper spiritual awareness. And historically, you could parallel this with how the way Hinduism was used in India to justify the caste system, but that could be a long digression. Um, in a sense, though, this focus on self and personal choice also really fits perfectly with American individualism. Even though I think that a lot of people's interest in the occult, shamanism, and New Age beliefs stems from like them feeling alienated by late capitalist society and searching for something, it then is manifested in a way that is channeled into justifying the status quo. And, it makes solving problems in the world something that can only be done on the individual mental level instead of solutions of collective action in the real world. We can't manifest or meditate ourselves out of World War III, for example. So, Max, would you like to talk a little bit about the background of this and trace it back to some of the stuff that went on in the 60s?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure that what we'll generally refer to as the New Age movement per se can exactly be traced to the New Left of the 60s, but I think it certainly shares roots with the overall broader counterculture of that period, which rejected established religious institutions and social norms, and obviously gradually with the influence of the drug culture, there developed amongst the counterculture an interest in spirituality and alternative lifestyles, where people were establishing communes and doing dietary fads, and this idea of living off the grid came about. Obviously, music and rock and roll was a big part of it as well, which we've discussed in previous episodes. But I think all of it was kind of wrapped up in the same shift culturally among the youth. And there was a lot of overlap between the two, in terms of participants. I don't think it's clear enough to say that the New Age movement in the 70s was a direct outgrowth of the New Left, but there's definitely a relationship and correlation.
There's a similar overlap with the interest of what was now called lifestyle politics.
Yeah, I mean, lifestyle politics, you could say, certainly came out of the New Left, and that milieu. I mean, we've spoken in previous decade or previous episodes about how the anti-war movement in the beginning of the 60s, at least, was, mostly associated with like Catholic organizations and socialist groups and was very serious politically. But gradually, with the context of the surrounding counterculture and the introduction of drugs into the scene, and then the rise of the hippie phenomenon. I mean, we've covered MK Ultra and Project Artichoke and Operation Midnight Climax and the various domestic intelligence operations that inserted drugs into the movement. And we touched on Tom O'Neill's book Chaos, which covers the role that MK Ultra may have played in the Sharon Tate murders and the Manson family. But with that transformation, however spontaneous or however engineered it was, generally speaking, I think there this turn inward happened where things began to focus on in the counterculture on interpersonal change and the exploration of spirituality and the influence of Eastern mysticism and the occult as well. And gradually less emphasis was placed on social change and addressing, you know, structural societal problems. Ironically, the counterculture of the 60s was, it was supposed to be a reaction against consumerism. But, as it moved into the 1970s, the New Age phenomenon, almost had the complete embrace and like rebranding of consumerism with this paradox of, seeking spirituality through the consumption of goods, the focus on self-improvement, through the like you were saying, purchasing of things like crystals or to taking yoga classes, going on wellness retreats, whatever it may be. All these fads, which gave rise to a whole new spiritual marketplace, so to speak, very much driven by individualism, and at the same time, often inauthentically like watering down or diluting the original deeper meaning of these like appropriated spiritual or ancient traditions or practices, turning them into these marketable commodities like prepackaged, healing crystals or whatever. And
Yeah.
this whole spiritual economy or industry, it markets these non-traditional paths to enlightenment and commodifies these ancient practices for profit, which, obviously raises questions about its authenticity. What were you going to say?
Oh, I was going to say that a good sort of coverage of the turn inward in the 60s is the third part of Adam Curtis's documentary about Edward Bernays, The Century of the
Hmm.
Self. I think the third part it's called There is a Policeman Inside All Our Heads, He Must Be Destroyed. And
Yeah.
he talks about that turn inward as well as actually he talks about sort of contrasting Freud with then Wilhelm Reich and subsequently Marcuse.
Yeah, that's a great, I mean, he unfortunately took a kind of neoconservative turn, but that is kind of a groundbreaking documentary, Century of the Self. And at one time, he was really doing some great work, and we recommend everybody watches that documentary. And I do, in the decades since all this stuff, now like we were discussing, it's become completely part of the mainstream. But looking back, like I do think there's a connection between the New Age phenomenon and the New Left in that not just that both movements overlapped with the 60s counterculture, but there was a general disillusionment with mainstream Western society, traditional institutions, and at least originally materialism. And so, they sought to create a new world. And like I said, well, the New Left was largely a politically based movement, which was centered on, achieving social justice, advancing civil rights causes, turning out to protest against the war, obviously, was a big, Vietnam War was a big part of it. It was also, critical of capitalism. On the other hand, what came out of it, arguably, the New Age movement, which came later, um, that primarily emphasized, personal spiritual growth, achieving inner peace, and enlightenment, holistic health, alternative medicine, and then also like alternative spiritual practices like astrology, yeah, like tarot card, transcendental meditation, and so on. Drew heavily from esotericism, not just new religious movements, but also there was also a popularization of a lot of ideas that were influenced by a movement in the 19th century known as the New Thought movement, which, I mean, this stuff is so commonplace now, people don't really even think about it and sort of take for granted and don't really realize where it came from. But the New Thought movement really popularized, these kind of like pseudoscientific buzzword concepts that are so much of a part of our culture now. I think people have forgotten where that comes from, but it was, like this idea of like, for example, you'll hear people talk about the law of attraction, this idea that like thought creates reality. The idea, the power of positive thinking is the key to like bettering one's health, achieving financial wealth or goals in life. I mean, you have all these like self-help books and infomercials, selling this stuff. If you want to achieve your goals in life and make more money and be happy, this stuff is all sold to people and they don't really have any idea what its origins are. And actually, this stuff associated with the New Thought movement and the popularity of self-help books, it continued into the 20th century. Actually, coming up in the anybody who's ever come up in the punk scene or like the hardcore punk community, there's a very, like one of the biggest bands in that scene was Bad Brains, who were, in addition to being Rastafarians, they were also big on this guy, Napoleon Hill, who wrote this book, Think and Grow Rich, that was very popular, self-help book. And, I love the Bad Brains musically, but the whole like PMA thing, the whole positive mental attitude that's very popular in like the hardcore scene and like the straight edge community, like people who abstain from drugs and eating meat and all that. That whole PMA thing, positive mental attitude, that comes from this guy, Napoleon Hill, who was very much influenced by the New Thought movement. And he was a fraudster. He was a financial scammer and a con artist. And so that's where that comes from, that whole, like the power of positive thinking can. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with being positive and, trying to look on the bright side and all that. But like, there's a point where this stuff starts to become quackery. And, the implications of these kinds of ideas are to blame individuals for their own misfortunes and simplifies, what are the results of complex social factors, whether it's like social issues at large or like one's individual problems in their own life.
Well,
And
I think,
yeah, go ahead.
well, as I say too, I think it can, you know, cause one, if one's just having a positive mental attitude, you could approach a really exploitive job and go, well, I'm just going to try to have a better attitude and get through it instead of, say, organizing a strike, or, for example.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's marketed as a lifestyle. I mean, there's nothing wrong with any of these things necessarily, like whether it's practicing yoga. I mean, there's many people I know who do yoga that, it has all kinds of health benefits and meditation as well. It's not to say that any of these things are necessarily individually like bad lifestyle practices. It's the larger point is that the mass marketing of this stuff, what was it taking the place of? And I think on a collective level, or rather on an individual level, it was taking the place of like making collective change. And fundamentally, there was a greater move towards individualistic spiritual approaches, which was a big departure from the structural focus of traditional left-wing politics. And the New Age movement also took from Eastern mystical philosophies. And at the end of the day, I do think a lot of this stuff was a consequence of the CIA's manipulation of the New Left and the counterculture and the promotion of drugs, which depoliticized the movement and was a major catalyst for, the New Age movement later, its idea or its emphasis on consciousness expansion, appropriating Eastern spirituality, popularizing alternative therapies, and so on. And you had, not coincidentally, at that time, the proliferation of cults, everything from Jim Jones, the People's Temple in the Bay Area. Well, actually, the People's Temple, I think, started in Indiana and then went to Ukiah, California, in the Bay Area, and then obviously later Guyana, obviously, where the infamous supposed mass suicide occurred. And there's a great essay, which we'll put a link to, detailing the evidence about the possible role of MK Ultra in that whole affair as well, and in the Jonestown massacre. I mean, and interestingly, I recently watched the Netflix documentary about the Rajneeshi cult out where you are in Oregon, and though in that documentary, there was a connection to the People's Temple, weirdly, or between the People's Temple and the Rajneeshi cult, in that the congressman Leo Ryan, who was famously killed in Guyana by Jim Jones's followers, he had gone there to investigate them and was killed by People's Temple's members, and that's what set off the whole standoff there, and then the supposed mass suicide. Well, weirdly, oddly enough, Jim Jones's daughter ended up joining the Rajneeshis in Oregon, so there was a weird, odd coincidence there. But the Rajneeshis, if people aren't familiar, he was this Indian guru who was expelled from India and came to the United States and set up this commune in Oregon and tried to, I mean, he had thousands of followers, and tried to almost nearly successfully, like, sort of almost take over Oregon in the same way that the Mormons took over Utah.
And he had a lot of money. And I would add one strange part of the whole incident is that they actually had like their own bioweapons lab and were breeding pathogens on US soil.
Yeah, I mean, they ended up committing a bioterror attack where they were trying to poison the local population in order to influence the outcome of local elections. I mean, there was basically this very sparsely populated town in Antelope, Oregon, I believe, which is in central Oregon. You can correct me if I'm wrong about that.
No, I
Uh,
think that sounds right.
and they incorporated a town after taking it over. It was called Rajneeshpuram, and it became a town run by the cult. And in order to influence the election, they like tried poisoning local residents who were against their little town being taken over. And the Rajneesh cult, it was one of many that appeared in the 70s and 80s. And interestingly, I'm just using them as an example because in addition to practicing meditation, they were also, paradoxically, very aggressively pro-capitalist in their ideology. And this idea of like personal fulfillment and enlightenment was very much wedded to, like, I mean, Rajneeshi basically, or Osho, as he was known by his followers, he was very into preaching like the accumulation of wealth. Actually, he had in when he was still based in India in the 60s and 70s, he was very critical of Gandhi, saying that he like glorified poverty, and that, I mean, there was a lot of problems with Gandhi in terms of racism and the caste system, but like he Rajneesh was critical in that he argued that basically India needed capitalism to overcome its backwardness. And he was very materialistic. I mean, he was famous for owning dozens of Rolls Royces, despite his professed beliefs about enlightenment. And But when he was based in India, he attracted wealthy Westerners, and so he eventually moved his movement to the United States. And this was just one of countless other cults during this time when these sort of ideas were still, on the fringe and part of on the margins. It wasn't, in corporate America yet. But a lot of these kinds of practices and fads like yoga and meditation went mainstream over time by evolving from they evolved from their ancient spiritual roots, and as it came west, it became this accessible thing, for promoting physical fitness and these like stress relief practices. A lot of this stuff was first popularized by Indian gurus in the U.S., like Osho, and was adopted by the New Age movement and celebrities and spread via the media and marketed through fitness clubs. I mean, there was all kinds of health and fitness cults. There was one I saw a documentary about called the Buddha Field, based in Los Angeles, who was another guru guy. And ultimately, this stuff slowly over time morphed into the billion-dollar wellness industry now, which is focused on these mind body benefits, to selling physical fitness and mental clarity. And through that trajectory, it's been totally divorced from its religious origins, at least for most of its practitioners in the West.
Well, that's I mean, the thing about it as well is that, most religions are to some degree collectivist, but what the New Age, loosely, all the New Age spiritualities now are very much purely individualistic, and they don't offer you a community in the same way that, for example, going to a church or a mosque would.
I mean, I will say, at least in the case of the cults, like for example with the Rajneeshis, I mean, they did actually, at least when it was on the fringe level, they did offer people some level of community if people had displaced feelings about community. Because, like, actually, the Rajneeshis, despite being such, pro-capitalist hypocrites, they actually made, from scratch a whole town. Like that town was largely underdeveloped, and they really industrialized the place. Unfortunately, the whole purpose was to enrich this guru guy and his I mean, people should really watch the documentary because his lieutenant, this woman Ma Anand Sheila, is actually very, very memorable. She's kind of a badass. And when the Netflix documentary premiered, people were very kind of enamored with her because she was kind of incredible. I mean, even though she obviously supposedly engineered this bioterror attack, luckily no one was killed, so people can laugh about it now. People just got poisoned, but and they got very sick, but nobody actually died. So she ended up getting a slap on the wrist and left the country. I think she went back to India, and he ended up, I think, getting a plea deal and coming back to India as well. Yeah, I mean, the New Age movement does really kind of take something that was collective in its roots as an ancient tradition and makes it something individually centered. Because it's not to say that there's anything wrong with a lot of these practices. Like I was saying about, I don't practice yoga myself, but I know it's been very beneficial to many people and a healthy thing. And obviously, eating healthy and practicing mindfulness, being more aware of oneself and to be in the present and to relieve oneself, dwelling on the past or worrying about the uncertainty of the future, to raise one's consciousness, to be at ease in the moment to moment of our lives, to appreciate what one has and to be grateful to be alive. All that's great. But the point is that these things were part of the fringe and then they became commodified slowly over time. And these sort of alternative lifestyles, now you have human resource departments at corporate jobs offering this stuff in place of, for example, offering better healthcare or providing benefits at all in some cases. I mean, you'll encounter employers offering wellness classes or contracting out to self-help firms that do meditation or mindfulness courses or whatever in place of better benefits or pay increases, certainly, which would benefit one's health and well-being. They don't want to do that. Paying your employees a living wage to start is a health benefit, but that's one that a lot of employers are not interested in, obviously. And it's obviously very easy to quell unrest within a workplace by offering this stuff. And there's a terrific book actually out there I'd recommend called Mindfulness by Ronald E. Purser. And he explores how this stuff uh, became co-opted by everything from corporations to the education system to even the military now. And as the book summary states, I've got it here. What if instead of changing the world, mindfulness has become a banal form of capitalist spirituality that mindlessly avoids social and political transformation, reinforcing the neoliberal status quo? And that's exactly what's taken place. And Purser demonstrates how corporations, schools, the US government, and even the military have co-opted it as a tool of social control and to pacify the masses into thinking that, the stress in their individual lives is entirely a self-created problem, or rather, the only thing that one can do about it is you can't change things on a collective level, so you have to just manage your own individual reaction to things. And this is something that's sold by the snake oil salesman of the wellness industry. And I
And
think from a Marxist perspective, true mindfulness, ultimately social liberation is what's needed. And at a certain point, this societal obsession with bettering oneself serves a pro-capitalist agenda and is a tool of the ruling class to keep people pacified from making any collective efforts to improve their social conditions and fundamentally shifts the blame for society's problems, whether it's people's, rampant mental health problems in our society, which is a huge issue today, physical health, people, illnesses and disease. It shifts it onto the individual rather than treating as a social issue. And obviously, these are things that, the solutions to these things on an individual level are certainly more affordable to the better off and wealthy who have more leisure time and free time to do this stuff. And a lot of this trend, he also traces how a lot of the big trend of companies jumping on this bandwagon really started with Silicon Valley and these big tech monopolies, taking this as a model where they're introducing mindfulness programs into their firms and taking these fads into the and popularizing it among their workforce to sort of like quell any dissent or organizing. And it's also at the same time give the illusion that, that they really care about their employees' health and their well-being and, to foster this false sense of community that's not really there. And at the same time shift the burden onto, their workforce who may have significant mental health problems or that their health problems physically or mentally maybe from poor working conditions or like a toxic work environment. And so this whole mindfulness revolution, now they have like these big conferences, these TED Talks where these wellness industry gurus, these guys who make tons of money selling these books, it's just taken over.
yeah, exactly. And I would argue in some respects, the sort of new agey mindfulness, I guess spirituality you'd call it, is almost it's like the religion of neoliberalism because it's all about improving yourself and one's acquisitions as an individual, manifesting and shaping the world to one's own will.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, It's interesting. I think that, when Zen Buddhism, I'm not an expert on it by any stretch, but I think when Zen Buddhism made its way and became popular in the West and appropriated, really, where this ancient tradition was turned into a fad. It was at least in the beginning on a countercultural, anti-establishment level. Like the beat movement, the beatniks in the 1950s. There was the Dharma Bums by Jack Kerouac. That book was like a gateway for many people to Eastern philosophy. Also, Hermann Hesse wrote the book Siddhartha. That was sort of the introduction for a lot of people. And then also, during the 60s, later with the hippie phenomenon, at least it was anti-establishment originally, but I think it rapidly morphed and was mainstreamed, above ground into basically the billion-dollar industry we have today, where any sort of radical elements that were initially part of it were basically neutered or diluted, and it's been transformed into something that's part of the status quo and a tool of corporate hegemony. I mean, I would argue to some extent that the introduction of the drug culture, as we've discussed in the past or in previous episodes, the CIA's manipulation of the New Left and the counterculture, that the insertion of drugs and whatnot played a big role in that. But it was at least it was part of the counterculture, however authentic or inauthentic it was, another debate entirely. But the popularization of something like Buddhism with its influence on the 60s counterculture definitely is tied into that. And the practice of like communal living, vegetarianism, meditation, alternatives to conventional religion and Western materialism, this idea of inner peace and mindfulness, personal freedom, expanding one's consciousness. That version of these spiritual practices was gradually commodified and became like a vehicle for corporate interests. And so this book, Big Mindfulness, he talks about how branches of the military are even doing this now. And he talks about how ironic it is that originally these sorts of spiritual practices, like Buddhist meditation especially, I don't I've never meditated, I don't know much about it, or I've tried to at least, but I haven't ever done it with any kind of professional. But the whole my understanding is that the whole point was, of detaching oneself, was to detach from your ego and just or to destroy the ego, basically to achieve Zen, to take the focus off yourself and to get rid of the illusion of self, basically, and also the separateness of oneself from others, in order to develop compassion and be less self-serving and to have less attachment to material things. And instead, with this appropriation, it's been transformed into like it's been reduced to these self-help techniques, that are all about materialism and selling products. And it's like the height of individualism. So like the entire original religious context has been removed, not to mention the whole ethical and moral purpose of the practices, at least as they were intended as ancient traditions. Though that's all been stripped from it. And instead it's serving, the forces of consumer capitalism and on a very individualistic cultural basis. And it's just been reduced to this, corporatized therapeutic technique or method. And the motivation, of course, by these corporations is, like in having, their workforce take wellness classes or whatever, it's to increase productivity, not to actually provide health benefits to workers. Now you have like on social media, I mean, and everywhere in our culture, you have these like buzzwords like practice self-care and all this BS about, change starting from within, and it's up to the individual to change themselves. And this is very much tied to, New Age spirituality and the new religious movements, which also just sort of like is a hodgepodge or cocktail of like the affectations of various Eastern philosophies and yes, Buddhism as well. And their ideas just have kind of like over time filtered into and become enmeshed with corporate America. And they offer, of course, now this very privatized and institutionalized version of mindfulness, which of course does not include raising awareness about, to make social changes or better working conditions or, to change the system we live in, the society we live in. It's everything starts with on the individual level and nothing, the corporate domination of our lives is unopposed and actually is reinforced by this stuff. And, this is sort of the problem I have with I mean, not to go off on too much of a off subject, but this is sort of the problem I have with psychiatry as well in many respects, and psychoanalysis as well, in that things like this, they don't address the social dimension or of the problems or stress in one's life and one's anxieties, the material conditions that lead to these things. Actually, Gabor Mate, who's the people don't know is the father of journalist Aaron Mate. He has a great book called "The Myth of Normal," which he's a worked he's clinical psychologist, and he has attempted to address this in terms of the way that physical and mental health problems in our society today, the fact that so many people are on SSRIs or prescription drugs. He talks about the neglect, the inadequacy of the current healthcare system in addressing the cultural or social aspect of why mental health problems and drug abuse and so on and so forth are so prevalent in our society. He talks about the way that psychiatry and all that as it's taught now anyway is or as it's practiced now anyway is actually not addressing those. It's just creating a brave new world basically, and masking the problem. And I think it's similar in a similar way. The wellness industry both privatizes and depoliticizes social problems and reduces them to mental or biological problems of individuals.
Well, in a
In,
sense,
of course, breathing techniques and meditation and all that is very helpful in managing stress or gaining clarity of mind. I'm not trying to say that there's anything wrong with that stuff. I'm just saying in terms of diagnosis, it's very myopic and doesn't get to the root of anything. Uh,
well, it doesn't ask why so many people are having so much stress in the first place, and as to what the larger societal causes of the stress might be. One can acclimate oneself to the alienation of capitalism by drinking green smoothies and meditating. It's a bit absurd.
Yeah, I mean, and the whole, as far as like the meditation and mindfulness stuff goes, I mean, the whole idea in Buddhism of knowing thyself through self-observation. At least my understanding was the whole point is to, like I was saying, dissolve the ego and to achieve a awakening, a connectedness with everything, that everything is one, to become one with the universe or whatever. To do that, you have to let go of the ego. But this adoption of New Age spirituality, it's all about the ego, and similarly, it's used by like Silicon Valley tech giants and other employers, or these mindfulness industry gurus that give these TED Talks and sell books. It's just a way of bypassing the social causes of human suffering and all the social decay going on. And like I was saying about the popularization of Buddhism in the West, it's been in over time it's been completely absorbed into institutions, whether it's public education, military, corporate America, and it has been absorbed in a way that by working within those institutions, it's having to cooperate with them, and then by doing that, it's been co-opted by these forces, by basically, the ruling class at large, by corporate America, by capitalism to serve its own interests. And so I think it's sort of very broad. I don't know if it's possible to trace all this stuff back to specifically the new left or the counterculture, but I think generally speaking, you can, the way that this stuff started out like on the fringes. And I mean, so much of the 60s, I mean, it's a cliche, that so many people that were part of the counterculture in the 60s, later became new age and then became yuppies, and Jerry Rubin from the Yippies and all that. I mean, so many people from that time, I mean, there's even that movie The Big Chill, right? I mean, it's a cliche, but it really is true. And a lot of this stuff that started out as like a fringe thing, it's part of mainstream, people taking yoga, spin classes. It's a thing that the wealthy do. And it's this mass marketing of wellness and buzzwords and all that. It's very much this idealistic form of thinking. And in some respects, I mean, this might seem like a divergence or a digression, but it might seem unrelated. But the way that these ideas started out with the counterculture and have become a part of corporate America and yuppie culture and fitness culture or whatever, it's very similar to things we've discussed related to, for example, like the identity politics that came out of the new left that got absorbed into the system in the form of things like DEI and like the BLM protests, for example. That's a similar thing where identity politics was corporatized. And Christian Parenti, actually, Michael Parenti's son, he wrote a great article about that called the First Privilege Walk. And if you remember during the George Floyd protests in 2020, there were all these occurrences of protesters and white participants at demonstrations, engaging in these like bizarre rituals that frankly really resembled new agey type stuff in that they were, doing these sorts of performative actions where they were like apologizing for the racism of their ancestors and trying to cleanse themselves of their internal biases and their racism by doing these interactive bizarre rituals. The in Seattle there was the Chop Chaz phenomenon, if you remember that,
How
which
could I not remember that?
yeah, you're in the Northwest. Yeah, no, I mean it was for those who've forgotten, it was attempt to establish an autonomous zone in a neighborhood in Seattle. And while these protesters had this extended days long occupation, they or sit in, they apparently like they established like a reverse hierarchical social structure where whites would, flagellate themselves and they would perform these like rituals of atonement for, the sins of slavery that their ancestors committed. And, it was really kind of quasi-religious. And, they also had these diversity quotas where like, people of certain backgrounds were centered based on their ethnic background and or gender and sexual orientation. And of course, that's attempt to cede leadership roles at the co-op to those who were less privileged. And, white participants were basically like encouraged to try or coerced really to try and overcome their fragility, which is their sensitivity in discussing racism. And as I mentioned, as we've discussed before, there was this University of Washington professor named Robin DiAngelo. She wrote a book called White Fragility that shot to the top of the New York Times bestseller list at that time, concurrent with that wave of protests. And I'm not trying to say that everything that went on was necessarily negative or that there wasn't anything good or, in drawing attention to systemic racism and the prison industrial complex and all that. But this movement, that movement, the George Floyd protests and BLM, it really bared the stigma, a lot of the problems that I think exist within the left today. And this is some of them. And collective punishment basically became the guiding principle in addressing racism at these protests, where like being white was almost basically treated like the idea of original sin on a religious basis. Where instead of addressing systemic racism, they ultimately were addressing white privilege rather than addressing its structural or socioeconomic basis. I mean, there was even some instances where they were like people were giving like they were even going around like almost with like a collection plate demanding like mini reparations from the white participants, which is yeah, it's like a collection plate at a worshipers at a church. I mean, it was very bizarre stuff. Uh, People might be wondering what does this have to do with New Agey stuff? Well, I think that there is a connection because Christian Parenti in his article, The First Privilege Walk, one other such ritual that really took off during the George Floyd protest was this thing called the Privilege Walk, where participants would physically step forward or backward in a line based on a series of statements that were read out loud by someone. And so they would ask a question like, have you ever been discriminated against based on your religion? Step forward if you have. And of course, everyone who was, or if you've ever been discriminated on against based on your race, step forward. And of course, people who were racial minorities would step forward, and the white participants would be stationary. And so that was to draw attention and to facilitate a discussion about privilege. And I mean, that was the stated purpose of it anyway, of making people more aware and to facilitate a discussion and to create a more inclusive environment and all that. And it was claimed it's not being done to shame people, but to draw attention to societal barriers based on social hierarchy and so on, and to make people into allies, allyship. And like I said, you also had that book, White Fragility, became very popular at that time. And after those protests, these sorts of practices were adopted with these DEI initiatives where employers were mandated to contract out to like diversity training firms and have their workforces participate in this kind of stuff. Very much like the way employers are also at the same time doing all this wellness shit. So I think there's a connection there. But Christian Parenti in this essay does a great job tracing this like kind of identity politics actually back to, we've discussed the Frankfurt School on this podcast many times, but Herbert Marcuse's wife or his widow. And in a similar way, this kind of identity politics, which started in academia and filtered down into the everyday work world and everyday life, it takes material and socioeconomic issues and turns it into a cultural issue. And, I really think like the backlash to this stuff is very similar or is part of the reason why Trump, got a mandate and was elected, reelected. I think it was the backlash to this stuff. It really backfired ultimately. And Christian Parenti, he says in the article, he says, quote, "The privilege walk relies on a methodological individualism that assumes macro-level social phenomena has micro-level causes and solutions. This fixation on individual choice and personal attitudes reproduces the epistemological fallacies of neoclassical economics and right-leaning social science." close quote. And he had a personal history with this because he, for a time, I guess, lived in the Bay Area, and he was familiar with the privilege walk long before it became popularized when it was called the Power Shuffle. I guess he was enrolled, I think, like in the 90s or 80s at a local college in the Bay Area. And he took a class where it was taught by a professor who I guess had learned it at a nonprofit that was run by Marcuse's widow, whose name was Erica Sharover Marcuse, who was one of his graduate students and became his partner. And that nonprofit apparently used the methodology of the privilege walk, or this idea that one can unlearn racism or oppression, which Erica Marcuse, or Ricky as she's known, Ricky Marcuse. It turns out her work, according to Parenti, was heavily influenced by a psychotherapy cult that was linked to Scientology, that was called reevaluation counseling. And there were a number of these kinds of therapy cults, like in the 80s. There's another one called the Sullivanian Institute that there was a New Yorker article about that I read not long ago. But this one was called reevaluation counseling, and it was founded by a guy named Harvey Jackins, if I'm saying it correctly. And he was actually a member of the Communist Party and was a labor organizer, I think back in the 40s and 50s. And he was actually persecuted under McCarthyism and brought before the House on Un-American Activities Committee. And very nobly, he refused to name names. Unfortunately, he took a negative turn and somehow he became involved or acquainted with L. Ron Hubbard and Dianetics. And he founded this therapy cult called reevaluation counseling. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense because because as Christian Parenti talks about in his article, he says, central to cults like Scientology and reevaluation counseling is the act of confession and self-abnegation in front of a group. That is what the privilege walk is all about. There being no standardized set of questions, the statements that one answers with a step forward or backward can become quite intimate and potentially very embarrassing. And that's what went on at those BLM protests. And you can see the similarities between something like the privilege walk and something like, what they do in Scientology, mental auditing or going clear, which is what they say. Supposedly Scientology, like the church, has all this blackmail material on or collateral on people like, these celebrity members like Tom Cruise or John Travolta. Like it's always been rumored that it's got like collateral on them, like confessing that they're really gay or something like that, and that it would ruin their Hollywood careers as straight leading men or whatever. I don't know if that's true, but either way, the whole thing about like in cults like Nexium and other like Scientology like cults, like the whole thing is that they get blackmail material on you and collateral, and then it has like this social hierarchy in it. But there are these therapy sessions that are very humiliating, and so you can see something like that, the similarities between something like the privilege walk and something like the mental auditing and in Scientology, where everything is reduced to a mindset, like where they sell this idea, like if you want to overcome your own problems, in this case, it's even worse because they're doing it for a social problem, not just your own. It's not just solving your own mental health or whatever. Like you want to achieve your goals in life and make money and blah 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 blah. You need to overcome your negative mindset or something like that. Now with something like this privilege walk shit, this identity politics, they're transforming that into, you want to overcome racism, you have to, basically mentally audit your racism. I mean, and it's no coincidence. I mean, the cults of the 60s. I mean, Manson was linked to Scientology, as was the Process Church. The Process Church was a breakaway faction of the Church of Scientology. that, I mean, also, we were talking about, the Hindu stuff. I mean, the Hare Krishnas, I mean, that whole thing came out of the 60s, and that's also very bizarre because my understanding is that in India, I don't know how to say it correctly. I think it's Hindutva. That's very much linked to Hindu nationalism and fascism. And here it's like this bizarre cult. It's this stuff is, this appropriation of stuff in the East, and it's brought here and it becomes commodified and these weird fringe ideas, and now it's
Yeah, I think that can be traced back further, though, with for example, Britain's colonization of India, because around, the turn of the 19th to the 20th century in Europe, there was a growing interest in the exoticism of the religions of the East, which then became incorporated into things like theosophy
Mhm.
and these other fringe occultic ideas.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, that's a very good point. It definitely long predates even the 50s and the beatniks and or the 60s counterculture. It certainly long predates that. I mean, yeah, occultism in Britain, Aleister Crowley and all that stuff. But I think it became a part of the popular consciousness later on. The counterculture, subcultures, it ultimately became it's anytime it started out as something against the status quo, it would very quickly be absorbed into the mainstream. And now you have the complete co-optation and commodification of things that were supposed to be, like spiritual practices to, benefit oneself. And now they're used to sell, very privileged lifestyles to aspiring yuppies and whatnot. It's a and the entire original purpose, that's in Japanese or Zen Buddhism, it's been completely removed, and it's all about reinforcing this very materialistic and very individually centered culture. And so I mean, as far as the connection I was trying to draw between, it might seem unrelated, as far as the connection I was trying to draw between the proliferation of identity politics hampering the left, and something like what's going on with the wellness industry. But I do think that there is some kind of connection there in that these are things that began with the counterculture in the 60s and have now become very much the status quo. And I think like Christian Parenti did a very good job sorting out, where the roots of that and how, like I'm not trying to attribute necessarily the work of Marcuse's wife to Marcuse, but there is some kind of a connection there because she was a graduate student of his, and he had a very contemptuous view of the masses as being too bourgeoisified and distracted by consumerism, and were too backwards to engage in any kind of that they were not the motor of revolution as Marx thought them to be, and that Marxism was wrong, and that instead any mass social change was going to come from underprivileged, marginalized groups. And however much was intended, I don't know, but clearly, Marcuse is regarded as the godfather in the New Left. I mean, and so I think that kind of cynicism about the masses. I mean, you can see why. I'm not trying to say that his widow's ideas came from his work, but I do think that there's an association there. I mean, this is someone he was married to and a student of his, so um, it is kind of surprising because it's like, God, really? I mean, you'd think he'd be above this kind of stuff, but at the same time, it's like, look at the identity politics shit that can be traced back to I mean, their defenders will try and decouple the identity politics of the day with, the Frankfurt School. But like when you like we talked about it on a previous podcast, you got the former vice president of the United States, Al Gore, invoking Adorno and Mark or Habermas's name, in a speech addressing the climate issue. I mean, and denouncing Trump.
I think the structural incorporation of identity politics by capitalism shows how, Marcuse's views that it would be minorities that sort of lead this revolution have been sort of disproven because, and I think, for example, we can see how too the New Age sort of spiritualities have also been incorporated into capitalism because I think that's sort of the problem with taking a philosophically idealist analysis of if you're not looking at, if you don't have an outlook of the world grounded in the historical situation and looking at the overarching structure of society and mode of production, it's easy to start going down these pathways that end up just getting reabsorbed into capitalism. I think another connection that emerges between the identity politics and the sort of use of mindfulness and meditation practices in the workplace is it's all seems to be on on the whole part of a larger effort to rebrand capitalism as some sort of feel-good, happy face on it.
Yeah, I mean, the wellness industry definitely serves that purpose. But you can even see how some of this, like the whole premise, like with even like with the identity politics stuff, like the idea that you can unlearn racism, like or just like teach anti-racism, like in like through like an employer like contracting out to like some firm that like sells this stuff. It's another form of self-help. It's just like identity politics packaged as self-help, basically. Because that's what employers now they're hiring like a firm to come in and like like they take a survey of employees, like how is your work environment? Have you encountered discrimination or microaggressions or any of this stuff, amongst, and then they try and basically like, instead of, I mean, that was the response of the Biden administration to the George Floyd murder was like not to pass any kind of substantive legislation to reform police. It was to basically mandate these DEI programs in institutions and workplaces. So now workers, people who had nothing to do with the death of George Floyd, are now being subjected to these courses in their workplace where they're having to unlearn their racism in the workplace. And of course, these people are sitting there going, "Well, I didn't kill George Floyd. Why the fuck am I having to do this?" And so I think that's where you get the backlash to this stuff. I'm certainly not saying that systemic, widespread societal racism is not a problem and that there isn't racism in workplaces. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that that's the fact that that's what they did in response to something like, the killing of George Floyd, which was, the death of Black Americans at the hands of law enforcement is a decades long problem that's mandating these bullshit DEI initiatives is not going to do anything about that. And it's what is it doing? It's shifting the blame of something that the government's responsible for, systemic racism of policing, training police to do this. And what are they doing? They're putting the blame on the average Joe. And it's not to say that there isn't widespread racism or or discrimination that doesn't need to be addressed. It's just that that was the sort of culture war response, and and also where you know that issue of race of systemic racism and policing was used just as like a wedge issue for the Democrats to get elected, but ultimately they did nothing about, and instead they used it to to mandate this stuff for employers who are given financial incentive to do it. I'm sure that they get like tax breaks and stuff I mean, that's why you have this whole conservative backlash to it. The whole notion of like DEI hires and that it's the same response to like affirmative action and stuff like that. And what does it do ultimately at the end of the day? It pits workers against each other based on race and gender and all this identity politics stuff as opposed to class. And so that's the end of the day, the consequence of it. But so yeah, I mean, this discussion has been pretty broad reaching. I mean, it is kind of a stretch in some ways, but I do think that there is a connection there in that the way that the stuff from the counterculture in the past has become part of the dominant culture today and ultimately reinforces the status quo.
I guess you could say another connection one can see between the identity politics and sort of these individualistic New Age beliefs is a lot of the people, for example, with the, in this house we believe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, yard
Yes.
signs oftentimes have things about being kind and being a good human, and if as
Yeah,
if
the yard sign class is what the yard sign liberal class. Yes.
as if though all everything comes down to is the individual choice of being kind.
Or
One could be
standing with Ukraine.
one could be a very kind CEO of a corporation and still be exploitive and would have to be to in order to have competition in the marketplace because, in capitalism, it's not dependent upon the ill or goodwill of the individual capitalist because each individual capitalist is, you know, under the pressure to compete with the other capitalists so as to grow and maintain their businesses. So it really doesn't come down to whether one is being kind or not.
Yeah, well, that makes me think actually what you're saying about the CEO being kind. That makes me think of the film Begonia, which
Yeah.
discussed a little bit the new Yorgos Lanthimos film, which we recommend people go see. It's very much has a commentary on neoliberal corporate culture and like sort of the adoption of this this presentation that one is addressing these kinds of id pol issues in the workplace while being at the same time a ruthless CEO that
For
doesn't
ex
care about people and
for example,
everyone
the
thinks is actually really a lizard person.
Emma Stone's character, and she's playing this high-ranking female CEO who's, seen on Time magazine and with Michelle Obama. She goes around telling her employees that they can go home early if they want, unless, of course, they still have work to do, in which case, they'd better finish their work because we don't want to be inefficient.
Yeah, I hate to invoke his name because he is ultimately very reactionary, but one thing that Slavoj Žižek is pretty good at pointing out is like the sort of under or the sort of like hidden intent behind like he makes a distinction between like the traditional form of authority, like in the workplace where the boss just tells you what to do and it doesn't care if you like it or not. Just do what you're told and that's it. Or actually, he does this with even with contrasting the different kinds of parenting now, like where there's the traditional parent that just is an authority figure and just tells you what to do, stay in line, that's it, versus the passive aggressive parent that's like, oh, he always gives the example about the grandmother's like the parent telling their child, giving them the option of whether they want to go to their grandfather's or grandparents' funeral. Whereas like the traditional parent would just say, your grandmother or your grandmother or your grandfather died. The funeral's this weekend. You have to go. End of story. Whereas now, the non-traditional parent would say, your grandmother or your grandfather died. You can go if you don't, or you can go if you want, but you're going to be judged if you don't. So it's like it's the same thing with the non-traditional boss now, like the boss trying to be your friend there's something more sinister about the latter than because at least you recognize the hierarchy, like there's the distinction between you, whereas this blurring of the lines, between authority figures, is more gray. And so there's something more sinister about that ultimately, that actually the traditional authority figure is actually less, in some respects, oppressive, because it's like, well, you can choose to not go to your grandmother's funeral, but you should feel bad about it, you know, or you should go to your grandmother's funeral, but you should want to, you should like it, as opposed to whether you like it or not, you have to go. It's a similar kind of thing with the workforce. I'm not ultimately a Zizek fan, but I think that is appropriate for this topic. We probably should be wrapping up pretty soon, unless you've got any final thoughts.
Yeah, I think that that's a good illustration with the difference in parenting styles. And I definitely agree that it's more sinister, especially combined with the encouragement for people to focus on being positive and just being optimistic. And of course, there's something wrong with being positive or optimistic about life in general. But I think there's something wrong about being positive and optimistic about, say, a really horrible working conditions or the general state of the world. Like somehow just having a good mindset will help. And that combined with the sort of encouragement of bosses to be very chummy with their workers all just serves to obfuscate the system itself and give it a friendlier look.
Yeah. Yeah, and certainly the adoption of this wellness industry stuff in workplaces is definitely gives that illusion. It creates this fake idea that the workplace is a community, that the employer really cares about their workers. Meanwhile, they're not paying them a living wage, and in place of that, or better benefits, and in place of that, they're offering a meditation Zoom session. It's just totally part of that. We want to thank everybody for watching and listening. Please remember to hit like and subscribe. If you're watching us on Substack or YouTube, please leave comments. We'd love to hear back from you. Any suggestions, anything at all. And if you're watching us on YouTube, we have a Substack. It's shaenahbatterson.substack.com. If you're watching us on Substack, we have a YouTube channel. It's at Captive Minds Pod. We also have an X account, which you can follow us. It's Captive Minds X. I'm Max Perry. Thank you for joining. Shaenah and I will post links. Thank you, Shaenah, as always, for putting everything together. And yeah, we'll be back soon for another episode of Captive Minds.
Thank you, everyone. And I do recommend that people go out and watch Begonia because it is a good film. And
Yes,
I plan on hopefully writing about it at some point, so we'll see.
take care.